I'm glad to be a moderator of this panel. My name is Tetiana Pechonchyk. I am representing the Human Rights Center ZMINA. We are a human rights organization based in Kiev and working across Ukraine, and glad to be co-organizers of this event for the second time. And I would like to invite to this stage my six brilliant panelists. First is Raymond Acquah, Director of Research at Multimedia Group Limited from Ghana. So Mr. Acquah, please have a seat on the stage. Alim Aliev, he is a Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute from Ukraine, my friend and colleague through many years, with whom we before worked in civil society, and he represented Crimea SOS many years ago. Our third speaker is Thierno Amadou Camara. He is a publishing director of Guinea114, author of the book on Russia's war against Ukraine, and he is from Guinea. So please, Mr. Camara, take a seat. Our fourth speaker is Uriã Fancelli, international politics analyst and author, and he is a political commentator for CNN Portugal from Brazil. Also, I would like to invite to this stage Brian Oruta. He is from Kenya, and he is senior digital reporter for the Star newspaper. As you see, we have many journalists and media professionals on this panel. And also, the last but not the least, I invite to the stage Dr. Swasti Rao. She's fellow at the Europe and Eurasia Centre, Manohar Parrikar Institute for and Analysis from India. So please, Swati, take a seat with us. And we will start this panel, and during the next hour and a half, we will be speaking about the Russian narratives which dominate across the globe and how they are shaping the minds of people in different countries, and how this distorted information also has an impact on politics, and what we as Ukrainians and also together with our friends and colleagues from other countries, what we can do with that, how we can reshape these narratives, because unfortunately we cannot bring all the people to Ukraine to show them what is happening here. And I would like to invite my first speaker. It's Alim Aliev. We will start from him. And my question to Alim is the following. Alim, you work for the Ukrainian Institute. It's an institution that promotes Ukrainian culture abroad. And from the second hand, you are also a Crimean Tatar and working from the very beginning of the occupation of Crimea with the situation of human rights, with debunking the myths, stereotypes. So I have two questions to you. The first question, when you work in different countries, what the most popular myths about Crimea do you encounter? And what Ukrainian Institute and Ukraine in general and Ukrainian civil society, I think media, can do with use of cultural work to deliver information about Ukrainians, about Ukraine, about Crimea, about Crimean Tatars. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tetiana. Good afternoon, dear friends, dear colleagues. It's an honor to be here and speak with you. My name is Alim Aliev, and as Tetiana said, we are dealing with cultural diplomacy. We are trying to build bridges between Ukraine society and societies abroad through the culture, academia, communication, and also through the research and analysis. If we talk about the narratives and narratives about Crimea in different countries, I will just give a broader context about our activities last year. We started to work with countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And also, of course, we started to analyze the messages about Ukraine and particularly about Crimea in such country and these regions and particular countries. And I just give a few highlights about the main disinformational narratives about Crimea in these regions. First, it's about anti-Western sentiment in Crimea. What it means that Russia frames the temporary occupation of Crimea as an act of self-determination, comparing it, if we talk about Africa, to African nations' liberation from colonial rule. And Russian officials emphasize that Crimea's return to Russia was based on the will of the so-called Crimean people, as seen in the controversial referendum in 2014. And the second narrative is about Russia presents the annexation of Crimea as an act of self-determination akin to African countries' struggle for independence. It seeks to draw parallels between its actions in Crimea and, for example, in Ghana, a historical fight against colonialism. Yeah, what we see today. I'm not only the deputy head of Ukrainian Institute, but I'm a Crimean charter, indigenous population of Ukraine. And for us, this war and this temporary occupation, it's our recolonization. It means that it's a new colonization of peninsula by the Russian Empire. And today the Russian state by itself is an empire. But their narratives, they try to turn and show that they're anti-colonial power, and today the Western countries trying to colonize Crimea also. One more narrative that important, that Russia frames the annexation as a sovereign issue, using to view the lens of territorial disputes. And for example, in different countries, issues between Russia and Ukraine, it's only internal issue of these countries, but not the issue of the international affairs. And what we do, if I can answer to your second question, what we do as a Ukrainian Institute in such countries, first of all, when we start to work in these countries, we should understand with what the perspective we should work. Yeah? What the main narrative about Ukraine culture, about Ukraine history, and current situation in such countries. That's why we started our research in this country. Second, what's important is to build the long-term contacts and bridges between Ukrainian society, Ukrainian artists, Ukrainian scholars, and, for example, artists from Brazil, artists from South Africa or Indonesia. And our first projects, it's joint projects, for example, in Brazil, joint projects between Ukrainian artist Sasha Korban and Brazilian artist Eduardo Cobra in São Paulo. And we choose one topic that common for Ukraine and for Brazil also. It's a topic of the ecology, and for Ukraine it's about, of course, the ecocide. In South Africa, we worked with a topic of children and deportation of Ukrainian children. And it's very important also, the issue of children important for South African countries. In Indonesia, we start to work with the topic of multiculturalism and, of course, the topic of Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Ukraine, because it's a story not about the migration of Muslim population in Europe, but it's a story about the native population of Muslim population in Europe. That's why the second, what is important to try to find this common ground between societies and common topics. And third, it's about human stories. We talk a lot the statistics, we talk a lot about the current situation, but we also should talk a lot about resistance and resilience of Ukrainian people. That's why we launched the communication campaign and launched the artistic campaign that gives more better understanding about the lives of these ordinary people in Ukraine. Last but not least, one of the main issue in academic sphere is the decolonizing of knowledge about Ukraine. And here we talk about Ukraine studies, you know, that together with permanent president and the fund, Presidential Fund for Education, we launched the Global Coalition for Ukraine Studies that should try to change this perspective and lines of learning Ukraine, not through Russia, for example, how it works in different countries, but through Ukraine. And I talk that now we have this period of reclaiming our voices. That's why I'm so happy that today we have a lot of people from different countries that help us reclaim these voices, but also build these bridges between our societies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is interesting how you select different also messages which might be relevant for some countries. I personally traveled to some countries in Africa and South America, and I think it's also not only about the working with some disinformation and propaganda narratives, but also with the history and the general awareness about the roots of this conflict and as invasion started from Crimea in 2014, general understanding about Crimea. For example, we met many people in different countries. These were journalists that were representatives of authorities from civil society. And when we asked people, whom do you think are natives, indigenous people of Crimea, they always replied Russians. So majority of them even didn't hear about Crimean Tatars, about this tragic history, what is happening now, how these people are facing this mass oppression nowadays again, as in the USSR times. So now we will switch to our guests from other countries, and we will speak how this is perceived by their societies in their respective countries through the lens of people living in these countries. And I would like to start from Ghana, actually the country I visited 2 years ago in October 2022. And from that times, I remember that year Ghana has a huge inflation which very badly hit the economy, markets, and the life of average people in Ghana, farmers, just people keeping some households. And when we talked with people about this crisis, which of course was also affected by the disruption of the grain supply chains and the war, impact of the war on the global economy and markets, and people said that you know that it's also Ukraine is to blame in this situation. So my question is to Mr. Raymond Acquah, who is actually representing the Media Group Limited, Ghana's largest media conglomerates, which covers over 60% of the audiences in Ghana. In your work, which narratives are dominating about Ukraine, about Crimea, about the situation here, and how correct they are based to the real situation.
Thank you so much. And let me start from the point you made about, and because I said I was going to be truthful and say only the truth. First and foremost, between 2017 and 2019, the average GDP growth in Ghana was 7%. Fact. In fact, in 2019, Ghana's growth was one of the highest in the world, not just on the continent. Indeed, then COVID came. COVID year, it was 0.5%, not even up to 1%. Then the next year, it started wobbling again. The government ran out of excuses. Yes, COVID was the main excuse for the low growth. Then the Hail Mary came from, at first, it was Russia attacking a country that is supplying us grains. That was the issue. Then with time, it changed to Ukraine's problems have become our problem. The executive president of Ghana, during his main State of the Nations address, told everybody that every single bullet hits directly our pockets. So what was a very distant problem became our problem too, even though we didn't know how we could help solve it. But that was not the most important conversation in Ghana. What was happening was that at the core, most people were made to believe, predominant Russian thinking, was that just like we fought for our own independence, the people of Crimea are fighting for their independence from Ukraine, not from Russia. And that Russia is helping them out in doing so. Now, that narrative to us is personal and important because, in fact, my ethnic group on 3 different occasions fought the British. They were able to colonize the, what they call it, the coastal people, but we within the Asante group, we didn't agree. Just yesterday, the British took the king of Asante and took him to the islands. The return of the king, its anniversary was celebrated just yesterday. So if any narrative says a grouping is fighting for their independence from Ukraine, we may not be able to send soldiers to go and help them. We may not be able to do anything beyond that, but we support a cause that says these are people fighting for their independence because we tried to do same some time ago. Now, when you extend that, the other narrative was also, well, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, it's a private matter between 2 family members. There's an expression in my mother tongue that says, the tongue and the teeth, they live in the same area. They fight, but they resolve their problems. So we should not care about it. The very first day, the president of Ghana actually made a statement in support of Ukraine. Ghanaians were wondering, why is that your business in the first place? Why are you seeking to interfere and intervene in a matter that has nothing to do with you? Which of the brother's side would you want to join? Then, let's not get it wrong, because the academics in Ghana who believe that they are opposed to the West. This narrative is also fundamental, that Ukraine representing Western interests and Russia representing the rest of us, and the rest of us are not privileged Westerners. So why should we support any grouping like that? And to many people in Ghana, if it is not, it will be quite unfair to our founding fathers. It will be unfair to the lives of Kwame Nkrumah if we are seen supporting Western countries and their prosperous quest to amass wealth and spread their tentacles. Why is that a business? So that's also something that really tilted the scales of public opinion against Ukraine. But at the top of it, at the top of all of this, is that why should we care when first and foremost, big-time Western countries are fighting a proxy war through Ukraine? In fact, the presumption is that the victim is rather Russia. And there were public lectures to portray that. For most people who can discern, for most people who can actually also read on their own, it's not, they can really separate the facts. But for a certain section of the population who were even opposed to their own government supporting Ukraine, they felt government has isolated itself from the people and was rather, as usual, pursuing a certain Western agenda. If you put this together, I insist that in the first few years of this war, not even way back from the 2014 years, the presumption was that Russia is right, Ukraine is wrong, and that there is nothing wrong with another narrative. There is nothing wrong with putting an area together. In fact, sometimes they even compare it to our quest to have a united Africa. That what is wrong with having everybody, especially when the language is almost the same, going back to join forces with their own. And that the current war is just a small price to pay for that reunification, which is important, which is needed, which is something that we should be doing even as Africans all together. That kind of narrative, and if people buy into it, they are justified because it makes sense and we can identify with those things. There is a political party that lost favor in Ghana in the 90s just because the leader of the political party asked South Africa to fight their own fight. Because our principle is that we, being the first nation, black African nation to gain independence, cannot fight against the independence of any other country. And that was spread out nicely to everybody. So I've just laid out about 7 scenarios where it was almost impossible to get Ukraine being, 1, the victim, 2, the ones that needed support, and 3, getting public sentiment in their direction. With time, and even today, it will be very strange for Ghanaians to say, oh no, we support Ukraine. The only time it became obvious to us there was a problem was that we heard of the numbers that were dying from Ukraine. And it was problematic for us. Regardless of how the sentiments were, it didn't make sense for a huge number of people to die as a result of whichever reunification, whichever independence quest that they had. So that is when I think sentiments started shifting in the direction of Ukraine. Had they done enough? No. Is there still massive support for Russia? And I need to point this out. Even before 2020, we didn't think it was possible that Russia could be operating a true farm from Ghana. So national security invaded the place. It was a big house with 16 people living there. Their job every day was to make sure that they spread propaganda on the internet. And sometimes it's not even targeted to Ghanaians, really. It was things that had nothing to do with us. The only problem the government had at the time was that as part of that was also sentiments that were opposing democracy, which then became a problem for locals. Because then it's not just about Ukraine. It's not just about the US. It's also about fighting a system of government which is still operating in Ghana. despite the difficulties with that system. So that's when government officially started opposing this. If you have seen or heard before, the president of Ghana met the US ambassador and told him that he should tell his government that in Burkina Faso, there's a mercenary group called Wagner operating there. We are worried about the tendency that they'll be coming to Ghana. So we have already put military people at the border because we fear that they will be extending to our country. It became a big issue for many people in Ghana too and elsewhere. But in terms of sentiments, this perhaps summarizes what has been the history of what Ghanaians have thought about, not only the aggression, but also how Russia has operated on the continent, perhaps on the blind spot of many people who are not taking that serious up to this point.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for these insights. Actually, I think that was very straightforward, but that was important also to hear how these narratives are being constructed. And that was actually my own impression when I was in Ghana. I remember, like, I was asking people how do they receive information, what is happening in Ukraine. Of course, something was covered by the local media, television, but people also mainly received the news from these big international TV channels and networks like CNN or BBC or others. But they said, and the coverage there was like reporting from Ukraine, more or less, you know, accurate and with standards. But at the same time, they said that in the social media, there are a lot of Russian propaganda, but I didn't know that you have these troll farms in Ghana. You know, it's like it's very deeply infiltrated. But I would like also to move to our next speaker and speak about the experience of Guinea. And Thierno was in Ukraine. He visited Ukraine, Kyiv and Odessa last year in 2023. And after that, he wrote a book with his perception of the war of Russia against Ukraine. So, Mr. Camara, can you share with us your observations and your thoughts how this war and the narratives are shaping the reality in your country?
Merci beaucoup, merci pour cette opportunité que vous me donnez. Et effectivement, j'ai eu le privilège. Brian qui est là, qui faisait aussi. Comme vient de le dire mon frère du Ghana, de découvrir sur le terrain.
So as the colleague from Ghana has duly said, we need to do what's going on. We need to update the knowledge into Ukraine. We can regret that here in Ukraine, we don't have people from that many African countries, and even my country, they do not have the Ukrainian vision of what's going on here. We only can get information from Western media and Russian media, which are strictly controlled by the Russian government.
And again, we should be mindful that they are overwhelming also, not only when presenting information about Ukraine in the African countries. And in order to clearly see what is happening actually in Ukraine and how Ukraine is perceived from the perspective of the African countries, frequently enough we hear that you should be supporting Russia, because once the Guinea gained its independence back in 1958, it immediately applied for support to the Soviet Union, which provided its support when France turned its back on us. And that time, there was a small number of citizens, of people in Guinea, that when it comes about the Soviet Union, it was not exclusively Russia, but Ukraine was part of it. But again, all of that was used in the terms of into humanitarian support, economic support, which was provided by Ukraine as part of that former Soviet Union, but again, a lot of articles have been published about those realities, but only at a later date, and it was not sufficient to provide us with a comprehensive understanding of that reality. And that's exactly what I described in my book, which in fact describes the relationship between Ukraine and Russian Federations, as well as the efforts made by Ukraine in order to build bridges of understanding and collaboration with the African countries, opening new embassies. Altogether, we will have all 20 of them in different African countries. In any case, when my books are published, some of the embassies I basically opening at that same time. In Cote d'Ivoire and Cameroon would be the most recent examples. So in any case, my visit was exceptionally fruitful and productive, helping me to better understand, granulate my understanding and the vision of this war. And we could clearly see that Russian armed aggression in Ukraine also relates to the African affairs, because the fight that Ukraine is carrying out is pretty much similar to what we had back in the 60s of the last century, which was the time when a number of African countries would be fighting the war for their own independence. And some of the territories were seized by superpowers, and we had to literally fight for our life, and not only survival, but life and independence, which exactly is what Ukraine is doing. And we do understand why Ukraine is requesting for additional weapons and support to be provided. And similar to that, diplomatic support should be provided by international community, which will be strengthening position of Ukraine and taking us closer to peace. On the other hand, I don't think that we should over and over again reiterate how that affects Africa, because that triggers inflation, that triggers economic difficulties, and Africa would be at the top of the list of the countries who will benefit from this war coming to the end. But in order to enable that, Ukraine must have the freedom and powers to make their choice.
And now we are going to hear about the experience of one more African country, Kenya, and I would like to invite to our conversation Mr. Brian Oruta, a journalist and the reporter from the Star newspaper, one of the Kenya's leading dailies, and which now also operates under the larger Radio Africa group. Hearing also our previous speakers from Guinea and from Ghana, are your experience and perception of your country is similar, and do you see these narratives are also dominating in Kenya, or what is the picture of this war in your country, and what challenges do you see?
I mean, the scenario is almost similar to almost all African countries, but now the only thing that looks different for my country is that the way they utilize the digital space to do this, to run this propaganda. I mean, any little chance they get to push their narrative, they will do it. You wake up today, you go to your social media platform, all hail Putin. They will take screenshots of that message. They will distribute it. They will give their influencers. I mean, I believe they pay people to do that. You find influencers with millions of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers, talking about how great Putin is. All African countries are really struggling with the issue of propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. Even us in newsrooms, that is what we do. Russians keep on devising ways of getting to the people. They want to get to the psychological aspects of people in most instances. For example, in my country, Just last week, they announced over 4,000 scholarships, fully funded. You go to study in Russia, you'll get education in Russia, but what else will you learn from the Russian side? You wouldn't know what someone will learn. They offer scholarships for Russian language classes. This is a call they just do on their social media accounts. And when you look at the number of people who applied to join these free Russian classes, it's a lot. So, yeah, they are working so hard to get to share their culture and their influence and their ideologies with Africa. Yes.
Thank you, and also I would like to invite our next speaker and speak about the experience of Brazil. One more country I visited half a year ago, a beautiful country, and also talk a lot with local people. And my perception, at least my own from Brazil, is that this war is not on the media or public discourse. It's somewhere very far away, and is not dominating in the media landscape. And people in Brazil, they are in general very sympathetic, especially if we speak about the human cost of this war, about war crimes, deportation of children. But they know very little about it, and now it's more of their attention is paid to the war between Israel and Palestine. And this is also like dominating the Brazil's intervention at the UN level, also condemning these atrocities while they are not doing this in the situation of Ukraine. So my question is to Uriã, is my perception correct? And what do you see and what can be done in Brazil? How can we work with Brazilian society?
Okay, first of all, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here again. Your perception is correct. It's a war that is not very widely talked about, but every time something major happens, as for example, a big strike or something, then people start talking about it again. I would like to read just a few headlines for you guys. Russia will do all it can to avoid a nuclear war, says Russia Chancellor. Ukraine has no chance to return their lost territories, says British media. Putin says that the Ukrainian conflict became global after the long-range missile attacks against Russia. Russia has the right to retaliate against military installations of other countries, says Putin. Putin accuses the US of participating in direct attacks, indirect Ukrainian attacks of long-range missiles. These are all headlines from a website that is called Brasil 247, which has 9.7 million visitors every month and was responsible for replicating 43% of the Sputnik content all over Brazil. That's in 1 year. We're talking about 1 year. So we can start seeing with these headlines how much Russian media and the Russian government has infiltrated the Brazilian media. They also tend to replicate this content. This content is replicated by influencers, because you have a lot of people in a highly polarized country talking about politics all the time. This polarization is explored by the Russian government, because when the country is so polarized, they can talk to the far right and the far left. With the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, for example, who visited Russia only a few days before the invasion, when most of the Western countries had already moved their diplomatic bodies outside Kyiv, he knew it was happening. He came here, he came to Russia anyway. He called Zelensky a comedian because he wanted to offend him. And yes, so that's also, I don't agree with earlier today there was a a Brazilian congressman here that is very sympathetic to the Brazilian president. I don't think that he should be here. That's just my opinion, because he's not your friend. He's using the opportunity to be here just to project himself. So be careful with that, because he's in the side of the former Brazilian president who likes other authoritarian leaders such as Vladimir Putin. So we should be very careful who we invite to be here. Well, and the second thing is that you have like authoritarian leaders that admire Putin. That's why we see Trump, for example, also having good relations with Putin. But at the same time, Russia knows how to explore the left, because the Brazilian left, which is also represented by the current government, by President Lula, has this anti-American vision. So they want to question the current global order. So Russia now is able to speak with both extremes that represent the mainstream in Brazilian politics today. So they explore polarization, they pretend that they are partners with Brazil. The Russian ambassador in Brazil is very present in the Brazilian media. I have a number here. He was quoted 176 times, only in 2023. In September last year, he was interviewed by the main newspaper. So what does it mean? It means that the main media news outlets are also giving space to both sides of the story. And that's a big mistake by the media, because there are situations where there are no two sides of the stories, and this is one of them. Another example that corroborates that, when we had a pandemic, we had certain people talking against vaccines. You know, there was like this health denialism, there's environmental denialism, and this is political denialism. So the media, in their constant search for the label of independence, sometimes ends up making a mistake of giving the same space to both sides, but that shouldn't be done. That shouldn't be done. You can't give a front page to Ukraine and a front page to Russia at the same time, because only one version of that is right. So this is something that we could talk about how it could be sorted out. There's also this big spread of this narrative of disnazification of Ukraine that is highly spread all over Brazil, like justifying the Russian action here. Russia also explores Brazil's discontentment with the current global order by saying that it will support Brazil become one of the UN's permanent members at the Security Council. Yes, I think that was just a small introduction to tell you how it's been done, but I can say what we could do together. I met a few Ukrainian journalists here today. Why can't they co-author articles with us? Marina writes for important news medias in Brazil, I do it. So we can find ways to work together and defend this narrative, which is not only a narrative, which is the truth. We can show them if we work together. So I think this is very important. Another aspect, in Brazil, in my state, where I come from, there are over 600,000 Ukrainian descendants. 80% of them are in my state, Paraná. Why not mobilize these people as well? Because that way, the discourse will be coming not only from Ukrainians, who will always be seen as outsiders, but from Brazilians. That's also a way that's something that could be explored. And I think, yes, Ukraine should strengthen its presence there, because Russia is doing that.
Yes, thank you for especially for your ideas, what we can do with that. And yeah, I think the Ukrainian diaspora can do more in Brazil, at least from what I saw, unlike in other countries where Ukrainians are really very active and they are organizing demonstrations. They are also trying to dominate, to influence the public discourse in Brazil, maybe because it's the descendants of the Ukrainians who are now feeling more like Brazilians. But we met some, for example, MP from Santa Catarina County, where also a lot of Ukrainians live, and I think it's also an opportunity that can be used. But I would like to speak about one more country I never visited, but I dream to be there. India, a huge, also big power in its region. And I would like to ask Swasti how the Indian society perceives this conflict, and what is the attitude, what narratives are dominating, and what we can do with that. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. The first thing is that we are having a huge panel, and I'm very happy to see the participation of so many countries that we call non-Western. So first of all, congratulations to Crimea Global for bringing such diverse voices together. And I think the one common thread that you see everywhere is that most of the stories are the same, which is that when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, I think the first casualty has been the truth, and that has been in many ways championed by the active Russian propaganda. As I was hearing to most of these panelists, you know, I would probably it would be equally applicable to my country, where you see that news headlines from Sputnik are reproduced without even any editing by a lot of major Indian news houses, or for example, a lot of these YouTube influencers with followers running in millions, because India is a country of 1.4 billion people, by the way, who just regurgitate the Russian propaganda, and that's how the situation is. So I think what I'm really struck about, and I've been taking notes also, is just how similar our own experiences as victims of the Russian propaganda. So I think that is something that we need, for me, that's a key takeaway here, one. The second thing is that, of course, when it comes to having a more informed discussion on the war, I think me as a scholar for last at least 3 years, much more directly, and before that I was working on European security, but last 3 years I've been working on the war directly, has been to bring about a more nuanced and a well-informed discussion about what is happening in Ukraine. Because yes, you do see that there are certain points or certain characteristics in which the Russian propaganda works, and to my mind, if I can sort of tell you what are the 4 or 5 most important points that you see the Russian propaganda operating upon. One is that Russia is actually the victim, and this is when the collective West has pushed Russia for this war because of NATO's eastward expansion. Poor Russia never wanted the war. Ukrainians are Russian cousins, and Putin is a man who always wanted to unite with the white Russians and the little Russians, you know, all that. So basically it is Russia that is the victim. That, I think, is one major key takeaway that I see in so many of these repetitive propaganda handles. The other is that with respect to the war, the Russian economy is actually doing very well, because most of the data is actually classified. I myself work on Russian data, and when I go to the Russian Ministry of Finance, for example, to see how the sanctions have impacted the oil revenues or the hydrocarbon revenues that have been falling from 2022 to 2023 to 2024, I see that most of the data and the sources are already classified. And because Russia is operating as a war economy, the perception that is then exported to these countries, a country that I also come from, is that, see, collective West is having such a problem. Germany is slowing down. The Europeans are not able to help Ukraine enough, but you look at Russia. All alone, Russia is really being this fortress Russia, where the Russian economy is doing so well, which is a blatant lie, okay? Those who work on it know that Russian economy is in deep trouble, but it doesn't come out. The other third point is on Crimea. I must mention it. the Russian propaganda operates on the fact, especially in India, that Crimea has always been Russian. I think we have discussed a lot about it. But I'll tell you why this propaganda is so successful in India. This propaganda is more successful in India because of this false equivalence that Russia has created between Crimea and Kashmir. Because India has these territorial sensitivities on the region of Kashmir, of course, which the history is entirely different. I mean, this is like comparing apples with oranges. But just because there is a territorial sensitivity that India has, Russia has always manipulated that sensitivity by creating this false equivalence with Crimea, saying that, listen, we support you on Kashmir, you support us on Crimea. And therefore, you see some very mainstream Indian scholars actually advocating a very unconvincing line of thought for the Russian conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is, let's have a ceasefire. Why? Because a ceasefire worked in Kashmir. Why? Because the roots go back to this false equivalence. And one of the reasons why I think when the representatives of the Crimea platform tried to come to India and the visas were denied was again because of the same thing, the sensitivities on Kashmir. So what you need to do, yesterday I talked about dehyphenating, right? I think what the Crimean people really need to do is to dehyphenate this false equivalence that no, Crimea is not Kashmir, for God's sake, stop comparing apples with oranges. Finally, I think there's also a lot of other things about Russia as invincible. Of course, everybody has mentioned that. I would just repeat it, that yes, in fact, people in India actually start this discussion by saying why the West is actually letting Ukrainians get killed in the war. You are only delaying the inevitable because it is impossible to defeat Russia on its home turf. So this kind of an invincibility in the Russian narrative and the fact that Putin remains a master strategist is something that every one of here, each one of us here has probably gone through, and this is something which is already there. Finally, if I would be allowed to tell you what really I think can counter this Russian propaganda, also from an Indian perspective. The first thing that I would say is that, yes, don't look at specialists. Specialists like me obviously know what is happening, but if you want to reach out to the larger public, the larger political discourse, the larger strategic discourse, I think it is much better to have a Russia plus one strategy, which is that fine, let the dynamics of Russia as a declining power play itself out because of the war in Ukraine, but if you go to Indians and say that Russia is a bad actor, Russia is the bad guy, basically what happens is that you start hitting the wall, because at that moment they close their minds down. And I think one of the things, I am on social media, I get trolled left, right and center for actually trying to state the truth, and I'm sure a lot of people here would, share those experiences. So the one thing is that go for a Russia plus one strategy. Instead of showing how bad it is to align with Russia, show how positive it is to align, align as in cooperate with Ukraine or try to understand the Ukrainian situation and also the larger West. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, I have to mention decolonizing of this knowledge about Ukraine, because you mentioned that, and I completely agree that Russia has been very, very successful in appropriating the entire historicity of its Soviet times, which is that now today when you talk about Russia, India says, oh, we had such great relations with Soviet Union, but then hello, Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union, isn't it? But today it's Russia that has completely appropriated that historicity. So I think that decolonizing of the knowledge production, something like Professor Mridula Ghosh is doing very well, that needs to be mainstreamed much more. We need to obviously build more efforts with the scholarly community, with the journalistic community. I think very good suggestions have been given here. One thing that I would like to mention here is the European Union's effort at disinformation, countering disinformation in the Indo-Pacific. And I believe that in the EU delegation in India is very active in that. The only thing that I tell them is that keep China in the front, keep Russia at the back. Because if you keep Russia at the back, again, the same thing happens, that you can't really discuss it beyond a certain point. So the EU efforts and the Ukrainian efforts to sort of mainstream this discourse should really connect these dots. It shouldn't be disconnected, because you really have to connect the dots. So EU efforts at countering the Russian propaganda must join hands with the Ukrainian efforts. Now some two very practical takeaways, which is that I genuinely feel that the business community, that Indian business community is present here. I have met so many of them, and one is sitting right here with us. I think the entire investment ecosystem and how, for example, the Odessa ports have actually been now exporting much more than the pre-war levels. You know, those kind of stories really need to come out, because yesterday I was talking about more practical solutions, and this is something that I would really ask the Indian business community to do here, you know, I would say, with a more clear-cut agenda. How do you reach out to the Indian business community out there in India? How do you convince them? Do you need the media to do that? Do you need the scholarly world to do that? Do you need, you know, I mean, you have to sort of take this conversation forward, because when I have met these people, I feel that they have never left Ukraine. They've always said that they will never leave the country, even if it is a country at war, because the country has given them so much in the last 30 years. And I think this kind of a situation needs to be brought out better, and the kind of potential that it holds. Then yesterday I mentioned the military-industrial complex. I would still stand by that and say that there is immense potential in the private defense sector units in India, not the public defense sector units, okay? The private defense, actors are looking at, creating these ties, especially when it comes to drone technology, and Ukraine remains to be a master at sort of that evolving the drone technology. So I think those kind of things are very important. And ultimately, I would say, I've already mentioned a lot of things. Yesterday, I mentioned how important is, for example, somebody like Anurag, who's a youth, and can be one of the major messengers of what really Ukraine stands for. But I think finally, all this really needs to sort of connect the dots better in order to make a difference. Because like I said, that it's not that the information is not there. The point is that the information, there is a smoke screen. And how do you sort of remove that smoke screen is perhaps everybody's challenge here. And lastly, you're most welcome to India whenever you want to come there. And we would look forward to your visit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech, and to all our distinguished panelists. I think we did a very quick snap overview of the globe and the dominating narratives, which from one side are similar in many countries, that Crimea was always Russian, that it's NATO provoked Russia to attack Ukraine, etc., etc. But also we see how the Russian propaganda is used to, to work with these sensitive issues for some countries, with some historical peculiarities in different countries. And now I have an honor to invite all of you, our room, to the dialogue. We have 20 minutes. I think I did my job good as a moderator. So we will have a lot of interaction, and I ask you to raise your hand, to represent yourself, and to ask your question. If you have some specific question to one of our guests, please say to whom. And I ask my colleagues with the mic in the room to give the mic to those willing to speak. Maybe we will have several questions, yes, and then we will answer, because I see a lot of hands. Who is with the microphone? Who can help? Okay, then I, as a moderator, will come.
Hello, everybody. I am Professor Gharany from Kyiv-Mogila Academy, the oldest university in Ukraine. And actually, I have not the question, but a small correction, but I think very, very important. Russia is talking about long-range missiles. And by repeating that, we are falling into the Russian trap. Why? You can check it on Google. What is long-range missiles? According to American and Russian qualification, how to say it, it's more than 5,000 kilometers long range. The middle range is from 1,000 to 5,000. And ATACMS, which we now received permission to use, is 300 kilometers. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a mic or not yet? Okay, Marco.
Good afternoon. My name is Marco Ferraro. I am a program officer in the EU delegation here for media and strategic communication. I have been in this country for many good years and now for 3 not happy ones. I feel very much part of what has been going on apart from my professional affiliation. I have a specific question, but I also want to say that My accent probably gives it away that I am Italian. My country, part of the European Union, NATO and everything else, but the media system has many of the same narratives that you've been mentioning today. Equivalence between Russia and the Soviet Union, Ukraine was like didn't exist, etc., etc. Your experiences have been kind of a cold shower, but a necessary cold shower. I think people who work on countering disinformation like me since 2022, we have been exposed to this cold shower, and the cold shower is that we stand for transparency in information, pluralism of information, facts, and human rights. But it seems to a large extent that after 2022, not many people outside of Europe were caring about this. The silver lining, I think, after 2 years of coping with the situation is that wherever we look, we see that there are some instinctive alignments of audiences. So traditionally, there are exceptions, but traditionally, let's say, post-neo-fascist everywhere, they tend to admire Russia, post-neo-Stalinist the same, but to some extent, we see that our messages of support for Ukraine's independence, democracy, rule of law, rules-based international order, sorry, I'm making this long, I'm aware, I'll keep it, I'm trying to conclude. Support for a rules-based international order are generally messages that are instinctively understood and also reproposed by civil society, human rights groups, activists who stand for individual freedoms, etc. This is in Europe, even in my own country, which I take as a kind of difficult case. Even in my own country, we see that the pro-Ukraine stance is instinctively understood by people who advocate for individual freedoms, rule of law, etc. How is it in your respective country? Sorry to take a long time. This is the question. Can we count on the fact that even in your countries there are at least these segments of the audiences, civil society, human rights group, etc., who understand what is going on? Meaning, can we count on them? Yeah. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, in French. Je remercie en tout cas les panélistes pour leur brillante intervention. Et je pense que pour les pays africains, on partage un facteur quand même important, c'est
The African countries, we do understand, and we usually have this as a particular feature, which is sensation of the lack of credible information about Ukraine. But the important thing is that Ukraine is disclosing itself to African countries, to the third countries of any bloc or outside that bloc. So an important area that we're touching upon is misinformation, because this propaganda machine, which is so heavily deployed by Russia, including in Africa. They also rely on social media, TikTok, and others. And yes, information is channeled broadly and generating respective messages to different audiences. And speaking of the TikTok as a platform, when you're trying to track information about the war between Russia and Ukraine, the impression is made that Ukraine is devastated and is beaten down to the ground, literally. But also, the voice of Ukraine should be clear and loud, particularly in the African countries, especially with the background of this food crisis, which was so painfully essential in different countries. We heard from different panelists today about the price rising, inflation processes, and other economic damage done as the result of that. So this is important to share objective information with the African countries, especially with the broader audience of young Africans, young people in particular, because they are very active in social media, but on the other hand, they have lack of access to the current transparent information. So my appeal to you is to think of those channels, of those messages which will make our stand stronger, which will empower us to fight with this propaganda. Because if we lose this war to propaganda, we will be losing other wars as well. So I'm committed to make that contribution, but I also invite all of you to join our efforts, but also invite you to broader discussion. How can we merge our efforts and make ourselves stronger in order to win it?
And then we will hear some reflections of our speakers, and then if you have time, we will have more questions from the room. Please, this lady, yes.
Thank you. Je vous remercie pour aller dire.
I do believe
but I think you'll forgive me because that's something too important to miss. So when a man attacks a woman, when we're talking about sexual violence, when there is a lot of victims that are not they don't feel comfortable to come out and speak up about what they suffered. And when one brave woman that's suffering a lot comes and says something about this, a lot of other people come up, a lot of other women feel empowered to take a stand and raise their voices against the aggressor. What I'm seeing here is a lot of countries that have been threatened and target of misinformation and disinformation. And I was listening to the stories of Brian, for instance, and thinking how the Brazilian scenario is also very similar to that. And I was thanking our colleague here because I think it's really important that we share experiences and knowledge and know-how to combat that. We're talking about very different countries, but we can build bridges and cooperation among them. So just to say, I'm sorry, it's more of a comment than a question, but Russia is also financing language schools in Brazil so that people can learn Russian. I had no idea about this. I was talking to an expert on propaganda in Brazil, and she told me this, and I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. They are financing exchanges of people to come to Brazil and study because, as Uriã said, Sputnik and RT are very spread out there. We, maybe from our academic bubbles, journalistic bubbles, we don't know this, but there's a lot of Telegram channels spreading misinformation. And just to finish, this week, a very well-known reporter in Brazil from Folha de São Paulo, which is the biggest magazine, the biggest newspaper in Brazil, went illegally to Russia to tell the other side of the war. That was really infuriating for us. It got on several coverages. I'd say like at least 6 articles were published in this newspaper. And,
let's say his name.
Okay, Igor Gilau is his name, and we could publish a counter piece on this series of reports from Igor Gilau. The piece obviously did not reach a lot of people. The newspaper censored the name of the reporter, so Igor Gilau is not criticized. It's so obviously for interests of the newspaper. But what I'm trying to say about this is that at least Ukrainian embassy in Brazil, we posted the text that about criticizing Igor Gilau coverage on the war, and I know that what Russia does in Latin America is they echo each other. So if Lavrov says something the embassies, all the Russian embassies in Latin America are going to echo that and repost that. So we have to build communities of knowledge and support to spread out our voices. Otherwise, we get suffocated and drowned on disinformation sea. So thank you for your speeches.
Thank you very much. Now we will have a quick reflection from our panel to the questions we receive, and then we will get back to you. So please, colleagues, if someone of you wants to have a floor, please. Yeah, Uriã.
I'd like to take Marco's question because we have some similarity. I also worked at the EU delegation in Brazil, and I covered a little bit of what the media section. I think you asked if there are segments in our countries that understand what's at stake. I think so, but still, they're facing difficulties within their country. So, for example, I don't think that only the approach towards defending democracy is enough today, because we can see democracy threatened even in Europe. For example, we saw in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland is gaining traction. It's a more pro-Russian party, and it's winning the regional elections in certain parts of the country. We see other more authoritarian parties and political figures rising to power. So I think we must find other common ground. It's something that I already said yesterday. So you mentioned that in Brazil people are sympathetic towards the humanitarian situation. So let's publish, let's show what's exactly it's happening, the atrocities, how young people are dying, how women are dying and are being raped by Russian soldiers. And I think that's added to other fields of cooperation, economic cooperations, highlighting the fact that Ukraine, such as in Brazil as well, they have common objectives in the longer term. I think that's something we can work for. Unfortunately, only turning to democracy is no longer enough when democracy itself is in crisis now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Please.
Just a minute.
Right.
And to show you how Russians are not sleeping, I mean, the Putin administration is not taking any chances to do this. When we visited here with Thierno Camara last year, after we had left to our various countries, one of us from Angola, he said the ambassador of Russia to Angola visited their offices, and he brought with him a whole load of books that say how good Russia is and how bad Ukraine is, because of the stories that he had published from the trip that we had here. So Ukraine, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to stop this aggressor from growing more roots into more African countries and Southern Asia, Southern America, and all other parts that they are trying to get. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Swasti?
I just wanted, because I saw Professor Ghosh, putting up her hand so many times, and I genuinely want to hear what she has to say. She is the only Indian woman that has been in Ukraine for the last 30, 40 years. She speaks Ukrainian, she speaks Russian, of course, alongside English, and her work on post-colonial project of how the Ukrainian identity is important and something that has inspired me no end. So I really want to know what you have to say. Yes, I think she would need the mic from somewhere, so just if you could give her the mic there. Yes.
Yeah, so. Yes, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for appreciating whatever humble work we could do with a lot of colleagues and not myself alone. My question, referring to the topic of the discussion, is that 2 points perhaps needed to be added. Is the role of the government and the political parties in India. Let me concentrate on my country. As a democracy, I do believe that the government has some say when it sends the tax police to the BBC offices, but it refuses to close Russia Today when West says close it down. More than that, Sputnik opened its media organization recently, and we had a gala opening ceremony with the presence of Dmitry Kiselyov in India. Everybody in Ukraine knows who is Dmitry Kiselyov, how he undermined Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty. even when there was no war, even when there was nothing. I don't need to explain who is Dmitry Kiselov to all Ukrainians. And on this backdrop, I would like to have a question. The role of political parties. In India, the political parties are siphoned off from foreign policy. It's a handful of policy think tanks which are close to the government, definitely. You know, they are not expressing necessarily very open opinion, even in academic institutions. So I do believe that the journalism schools and the academia, they have a role to play in shaping the information space, because we have social media today, we have many other things. I really thank Dr. Rao for exposing a lot of that, but I believe that you would agree with me that the role of political parties and that of the government, with the very serious situation that we have in proposing multi-alignment and all kinds of policies, that cannot be an argument to allow mass-scale misinformation of the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer this question or reflection? Yeah?
I mean, I don't have much to add. All I would say is that, of course, your reading is correct, and I don't expect audience here, you know, in Ukraine to be really in the right know-how of how exactly the political spectrum in India is today. But yes, we do have a leader, a prime minister who's running a third term, who's perceived as a conservative right-winger, and one of the other propaganda successes by Russia is that Russia has also somewhere equated the fact that conservative right-wing is very pro-Russian in India. Anywhere else in the world, you would think that, okay, conservatives would be more neoliberal in their approach, but not so in India. So that's something that I agree with. But very quickly, how that can be changed, you know, Professor Ghosh, I think both of you and I would agree, and we've talked about it so much, that it is really difficult to somewhere change the mindset of those that have created or made a career out of Russia-India bonhomie. And that runs in the bureaucracy, that runs in academia, that runs in journalism. But what I can say now is that the average Indian today is much more worried about his or her economic well-being. They're much more worried about whether India's economic success story continues or not. And frankly, they are more worried about what China is capable to doing to us on the border, because we have a long-standing dispute with China. And lastly, I would just say that I think kudos to Ukrainian defenders who have also showed that the Russian weapons that we thought were indispensable or inevitable, that we thought were invincible, are not really that invincible. So, and a quick, a repercussion of that is that, frankly, the professional Indian armed forces have not really placed a new order with Russia, and ever since the war in Ukraine began, even though Russia remains our biggest defense supplier. So I think there is a lot of change already. If you were to scratch the surface and go beyond the political rhetoric, you would already see that today India's most important strategic partner in the US. But at the same time, I would agree that this does not amount to saying that the political opinion also is changing, right? So I think that would take some time, and we have to keep at it. So it's a work in progress.
Thank you. And the floor goes to Alim, and then Raymond.
I try to be short, yeah. To be honest, last 30 years, we haven't built the systematic relations between our countries. But we really have this shift last 2 years. Even this conference, even the new communications strategy by MFA for Latin America and Africa, coalitions of Ukraine experts, and this exchange really works. But also when we talk about the grain, you know, this campaign grain from Ukraine, from the Ukraine side, yeah, when we stress about the global role of Ukraine in the trade. But when we talk about Crimea, I just give the latest news from Crimea, and I want to use this tribune to talk about it. This morning, all of Crimean Tatars and a lot of people from Crimea and in Kiev also concerned about one news. Yesterday, one of the journalists from Ukraine She's the editor-in-chief of only one children's magazine, Ediye Muslimova, forcibly kidnapped in Crimea by FSB. And during next few days, this case can be a new case of political prisoner in Crimea. But Russia, of course, will show this case as a fight against terrorists and extremists. That's why today I hear a lot of journalists. I ask to cover this topic, because when we talk about disinformation and about fighting all of this Russian propaganda, it's one of the main live cases that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the floor goes to Raymond and then to Thierno.
In 1963, Kwame Nkrumah asked a question to a forum like this: who is the enemy? And his response was that the enemy might not necessarily be the people you are fighting today. In Africa today, and I would say the chunk of, for example, in Ghana, you cannot convince Ghanaians that you are fighting for democracy is the reason why they should support or they should be sympathetic towards any cause. They'll be very suspicious of you. You cannot convince them that this is also an ideological war. But what will get them convinced is that this is a fight to stop the killing of a group of people who have done absolutely nothing against anybody. That is humanitarian, it is sensible. Every proper human being would identify with that cause. Why is it so? If you want to convince, say, and Ghanaian academics are predominantly left people, they are left of the center. Historically, it makes sense for them to be, and they are suspicious of the West because there's evidence to back that suspicion. What convinces Ghanaians more to identify with any proper cause is stop killing people who have done nothing to you and live and let us live. That has been a very strong argument in '63. It remains a strong argument in 2024. So yes, you will fight misconception. And again, today, there's a lot more fight about what Russia is able to do on the continent. Afrobarometer's most recent rounds suggest Africans are believing less in democracy. They are entertaining the ideas that other systems are better than what we experimented over the period. So it is not easy just saying that, oh, well, that is the bad guy, especially when that expression is coming from a certain Western country. We know his history, including ones that have elected Donald Trump as president, quite frankly. So we also have an understanding of what's happening. It should make sense that you also appreciate that that support will come in through proper education of the people. But I believe the biggest argument for anybody to back a cause is that it doesn't make sense to kill human beings merely because you can do so, merely because you want to be bigger, merely because you are a bigger nation and you are irrational in your engagements. That gets a lot of people on board. And I must also say that this is my first time in Ukraine. I have had family members who are schooling here and all of that. But I have received more than 5 invitations to Russia that I have not been able to honor. I mean, proud, no, I'm not, because of circumstances anyway. No, not because I didn't want to go. I am saying so, but it's also unfair to ask a nation that's being bombarded to spend quality time and energy fighting misinformation. So it's our collective responsibility to help out. After all, most of us, we are all members of the United Nations. Is it not so? It's our collective responsibility to help out. I feel deep within me, it's irrational to say the victim should do more in educating people. A lot of pressure on the same group of people. When I go to the Ghanaian, Ukrainian embassy in Ghana, it's a simple building with about 2 or 3 people within the building. I'm not expecting them to be extraordinary. If it was an attack on Ghana, I wasn't going to expect Ghana to be extraordinary. Let's stop this activity of making victims look like they are the problem, and that they should be doing more, and that they should be spreading out. They should be educating more. Really? It is conscionable that we do what is right. And what is right means reporting right. What is right means standing for the right thing to be done. It has nothing to do with ideology. It has everything to do with humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will hear now the last words from Thierno, and we will wrap up this panel because coffee break has started.
Ok. Je voudrais juste...
I would like to... I would like to say that among the ideas that exist everywhere, including Ukraine, there is the narrative that Africa, by default, belongs to Russia, which is not true. Yes, indeed, there are many more Russian embassies than Ukrainian embassies, but I would not say that Russia has conquered African countries. In my country, there is a very good example. We read that a Russian minister came to us for a visit, but then there was a statement from our ministry saying that, sorry, our country is not ready to provide these exceptions for the mining industry of the Russian Federation, which they wanted to get so much, which shows that we are actually capable to try and repel the ideas that Russia wants to impose. So we have the capacity to repel Russian ideas. And some people have this kind of neutral stance with regards to this war, and I understand it's also typical for our state, but we don't want to end up in a system where we'll be just scared to tell the truth about Russia. And my book is dedicated to that, why we have to take the risk, why we have to tell the truth about Russia. It's important. And indeed, it's important to help African media, African civil society revise their opinion and their ideas about Russia. They might have knowledge, they might not have not enough knowledge to see what's going on here, but Ukraine is taking effort, is trying to talk to people of our countries, and we need to support this. Ukraine is telling about the grain shipments, and Ukraine has been telling about the trilateral agreement with the UN, and everyone says, oh, it was Russia's goodwill. But there was also Ukrainian goodwill that despite the terrible war, Ukraine keeps exporting grain. And Russia unilaterally decided to just leave the grain deal. So once again, we need to do more to support the efforts of Ukraine, and we need to win the audience.
I cannot take more questions from the room. You can speak with our guests during the coffee break. I would like to thank all our panelists for their enlightening speeches, and not only for showing us some, sad situation with dominating narratives, with disinformation, propaganda, but with many, many ideas what we can do, and especially what we can do together, how we can use culture, how we can create some mutual projects, how we can publish op-eds, joint op-eds. Uriã, I would like to partner you and
we're gonna do that
publicize something for Brazilian media. So colleagues, now it's a time for a break, and the next panel will be connected to this one because it will be about the Soviet heritage in the non-Western countries. Thank you.